The desert air was sharp with the kind of silence that seemed to swallow every sound, a battlefield hush before the storm that everyone knew was coming. The horizon shimmered with heat, even though it was dusk, the sun dripping like molten gold into the sand. The platoon crouched low behind the ridge, their rifles trained but their nerves fraying. They had been pinned for hours by an enemy sniper no one could see, someone who had turned the open plain into a killing ground. Each time one of the men tried to shift positions, a single bullet cracked and forced them flat again. Supplies were running thin, comms were jammed, and the only way out was forward. But forward meant exposing themselves to that unseen eye that never missed. The commander, a grizzled man with a face carved by years of war, surveyed his team. They were brave soldiers, but none of them could take that impossible shot. The shot that would mean lifting their heads high enough to locate the sniper's glint, calculating the distance in a split second and striking before being struck. One of the younger men whispered hoarsely, "Sir, who's gonna make that shot? Who's crazy enough to even try?" The commander didn't answer right away. He looked down the line, his eyes settling on a figure apart from the rest. She was calm, her breathing steady, as if the weight of death pressing over them was no more than a passing wind. Her rifle lay across her lap, longer than the standard issue, customized with care. She hadn't moved since they took cover, her eyes always tilted upward toward the high ledge of rock that loomed above them. The commander's jaw tightened, and when he finally answered, he didn't use words meant for reassurance or drama. He simply lifted a calloused finger, pointing toward the ridge toward her, and said with complete certainty, "Her." The squad shifted, startled but not entirely surprised. They had heard the rumors about her, the sniper who had ended battles before they began, the soldier whose shot was said to travel like fate itself. But none of them had truly believed those stories until now, when the commander's confidence made them real. She stood, slow and deliberate, her movements precise, wasting no energy. Dust lifted around her boots as she stepped forward, raising the rifle with the familiarity of one who had lived more hours with it than without it. The men held their breath. No one else moved. The world seemed to narrow around her, as if the entire desert and all its heat and danger collapsed into a single invisible line between her eye and the enemy. She dropped to one knee, adjusting her scope, but she wasn't searching. She already knew. That was what unsettled them most. She didn't scan, didn't hesitate, didn't guess. Her hands steadied the rifle as though she had seen the shot days ago, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the hidden sniper shifted, confident in his dominance, certain no one could touch him. He had no idea he was already in her crosshairs. Her breathing slowed, each inhale and exhale timed with the faint pulse in her temple. The wind dipped, a rare stillness brushing the ridge. She squeezed the trigger with the calm of a surgeon making the first incision. The crack split the air, echoing across the canyon, and then, silence. Not the tense silence of before, but something different, heavier, final. The men held their breath, waiting for the inevitable countershot, but none came. The enemy's eye was closed forever. She lowered the rifle, not with triumph but with inevitability, as if she had only completed a task she was always meant to do. The commander gave a single nod, his expression unchanged. The soldiers around her looked at her with a mixture of awe and unease, because in that moment they realized something. Courage and skill had boundaries, but what she carried was something else, something colder, sharper, almost frightening in its certainty. She did not smile, did not celebrate, did not even look at the men who now stared at her with new reverence. She simply checked her weapon, dusted the sand from her knee and returned to her place on the ridge, her eyes once more turned upward, as if already searching for the next impossible shot that only she would ever take. Night settled over the desert like a cloak of ink, swallowing the last of the sun's fire. The platoon had moved forward now that the unseen sniper was gone, but their relief was muted, cautious. Every step forward felt like treading on glass, each shadow a possible trap. The commander ordered silence, their boots sinking softly into the sand, their breathing the only sound that dared to rise in the dark. They advanced in staggered formation, eyes sweeping the dunes, ears tuned to the faintest whisper of movement. Yet even in that fragile quiet, the men carried with them the memory of what had just happened, the way she had ended the stalemate with a single shot, the way certainty had flowed from her trigger finger into the lives of all of them. Some whispered prayers of gratitude under their breath, though none dared to speak aloud to her. She walked among them, unhurried, her rifle cradled against her body like an extension of her soul. She did not look back, did not bask in their silent awe. Her eyes kept scanning the horizon, as though she alone knew the night had teeth that would not stay buried. The desert was treacherous at night. Temperature plunged, winds carried voices across impossible distances, and the sand itself seemed to shift underfoot as if alive. Somewhere beyond their sight the enemy was still there, regrouping, preparing. They all knew that the sniper she had killed was not the only threat. He had been the eyes of something larger, something hidden. And though the platoon trusted their commander, though they had faith in one another, an unspoken thought threaded through the ranks. If death came again, it would be her who stood between them and the grave. The commander understood this better than any of them. He had seen soldiers who inspired courage before, but this was different. She didn't inspire courage so much as she imposed it, bending the fear of men into silence by her very presence. He kept his eyes ahead, but his mind replayed the countless missions where they should have been lost, where impossible odds had been broken by the weight of a single bullet from her rifle. She was not just a soldier, she was a weapon the world could barely comprehend. They reached the ruins of an old outpost just before midnight, crumbling stone walls half buried in sand. The commander ordered them to take cover inside, the platoon fanning out with well-practiced precision. Fires were forbidden, the cold had to be endured. They sat in the shadows, rifles across their knees, listening to the wind whisper through broken windows. No one spoke except for the soft clink of gear or the scratch of boots on stone. She sat apart as always at the highest point she could find, a half-collapsed tower that leaned toward the stars. From there she could see everything, the jagged horizon, the ridges of dunes, the infinite black sky. Her scope caught faint glimmers now and then, the stars themselves, the distant reflection of metal too small for ordinary eyes to notice. She watched without rest, without shifting, as if her body needed nothing but the focus of her gaze. Hours stretched thin. Men dozed in turns, waking with shivers, muttering in dreams of home. The commander checked his maps, though he knew their position by heart. The mission was simple in theory. Move through the desert, strike the enemy's forward base and cut the supply lines. In practice it was a march through hell and they all knew it. Somewhere in that dark, a sound broke the quiet, a faint scrape too deliberate to be wind. Instantly she tensed, her finger curling near the trigger. Her eye locked through the scope, searching the edges of shadow. The commander, watching from below, noticed the subtle shift in her posture and signaled his men into silence. Not a whisper, not a breath stirred. The scrape came again, closer this time, the telltale rhythm of boots carefully pressing against stone. Her rifle tilted by a hair's breadth, her scope narrowing in on a patch of darkness where no man should be. A fragment of light caught on glass, binoculars just for a heartbeat, and then vanished. Without hesitation she fired, the sound thunderous in the stillness. A strangled cry split the night, followed by a scuffle of bodies retreating into the dunes. The men below surged to their feet, rifles raised, eyes wide. The commander barked them into restraint, no wild fire, no wasted bullets. Her shot had already done the work. They heard scrambling, curses in a tongue that was not their own, the chaos of men who had thought themselves hunters, suddenly turned prey. Then silence returned, heavier than before. She lowered her rifle again, her breathing steady, and climbed down from the tower as if nothing had happened. The men stared, some in awe, some in unease. It was one thing to kill an enemy in the heat of battle, where chaos demanded it. It was another to strike like that in the still night, pulling death from the shadows as though she had been waiting for it. The commander didn't praise her, didn't speak at all because he knew she didn't need words. She moved past him, settling by a broken wall, her eyes once again toward the horizon. It was not victory that lived in her gaze but anticipation, as though the battle had only begun. The men followed her lead, tightening their formation, their trust in her now absolute, even if it came with the chill of fear. For in their hearts they understood. Tomorrow, when the desert burned again with gunfire, it would not be courage or strategy that saved them. It would be her. The ridge gave them a temporary advantage, a view stretching miles across the desert, but with that advantage came the cruel knowledge that every mile still ahead was painted with danger. They fortified as best they could, setting up a perimeter, rationing what little water remained, and tending to the few wounds sustained in the firefight. The men moved with automatic discipline, but their eyes always drifted back to her, to the figure who now sat alone at the edge of the ridge with her rifle propped against her knee, scanning the horizon as though the battle had not ended at all. It was not hero worship that filled them, not even gratitude, but something stranger, a mix of reliance and unease, as though they were tethered to her and afraid of what would happen if that tether snapped. The commander, too, felt the weight of it. He was no stranger to leading men, to victories and losses alike, but never had he seen a single soldier alter the rhythm of an entire unit with such quiet inevitability. He wondered, not for the first time, whether she was born to the rifle or whether it had made her into what she was now, a question that had no answer but lingered all the same. As evening approached, the desert cooling once again, scouts reported movement on the horizon, columns of dust where no natural wind could have stirred it. Enemy reinforcements, larger and better organized, converging like predators who had smelled blood. The platoon tensed, knowing they could not hold the ridge for long, not with dwindling supplies and no reinforcements of their own. Some whispered about retreat, about slipping into the dunes under cover of night, but the commander's jaw tightened at the thought. Retreat would mean death scattered across the sand, picked off one by one, and worse, it would mean abandoning the mission that had brought them here. The supply lines had to be cut, or the war itself would stretch into years of blood. He turned his eyes toward her, and for a long moment their gazes locked. He did not speak, did not ask, because he knew she already understood. She stood slowly, brushing sand from her uniform, lifting her rifle with the same calmness she always carried, and stepped to the highest point of the ridge. The men fell silent, watching her, their fear balanced precariously against their hope. She lay prone now, adjusting her scope, her body still as stone, her mind narrowing into that invisible line of calculation and inevitability. The dust columns drew closer, shapes resolving into armored vehicles and infantry moving with deadly coordination. The men cursed under their breath, counting numbers they knew they could not match. Yet when she spoke at last, her voice was low and even, carrying across the ridge with a certainty that cut through despair. "They won't reach us." It was not a promise of protection, not even reassurance, but a statement of fact, like saying the sun would rise. Then the rifle thundered, and the lead vehicle burst into flames, shattering the enemy's formation. She fired again, each shot deliberate, each one collapsing another thread of the enemy's advance. The platoon joined in, rifles cracking, grenades exploding, but it was her rhythm that dictated the pace of the battle, her precision that broke the enemy's momentum. Soldiers fell before they had the chance to lift their weapons, vehicles stalled in chaos, and the desert itself seemed to echo with her dominance. Minutes bled into eternity, the air thick with smoke and sand, until at last the survivors broke, scattering back into the distance, their attack shattered before it could even strike. The ridge held, improbably, impossibly, because of her. When silence fell once more, the men were too stunned to cheer, too drained even to breathe properly. They looked at her as if she were not one of them at all but something else, something forged for war alone. She lowered her rifle, eyes still fixed on the horizon, searching for threats that might not come. The commander approached her, his voice low enough only she could hear. "One day, soldier, the shot you need won't be there." She did not turn, did not answer, only blinked slowly and kept watching. The commander felt a chill crawl his spine, not from the desert night but from the truth of it. She did not believe that day would ever come. For the men, it was enough to know she was still watching, still breathing, still ready, but for him, the burden of leading her, of relying on her, grew heavier with each impossible victory. The night after the battle on the ridge was one of restless silence, the kind of silence that carried the weight of questions none of the men dared to voice. They had survived against odds so steep that even hardened veterans could hardly believe it, yet instead of celebrating they found themselves staring into the darkness, waiting for the next shadow to move, the next sound to betray another threat. Some sat with their rifles clutched too tightly, others prayed in whispers, and a few stared at her as though she were less a comrade than a talisman of survival. She remained apart as always, her rifle within reach, her gaze never softening, as though she carried an internal map of dangers invisible to anyone else. The commander moved among his men, offering words he himself was not sure he believed, but when his eyes rested on her, he felt both reassured and unsettled. He knew he was leading soldiers, but he also knew that she was not simply a soldier. She was a force, something sharpened by war into a weapon so pure that humanity seemed to slip away from her in pieces. Dawn came cruelly, with no time for proper rest, and the order was given to move again. Their mission had not changed. The supply lines still awaited destruction, the enemy still moved like a tide beyond the horizon, and so they descended from the ridge with weary legs and hearts that clung to the rhythm of her rifle as though it were a heartbeat. The desert tested them at every step, sandstorms tearing visibility to shreds, sun hammering them until skin blistered and lips bled, but still they pressed forward. At times the commander wondered if the men marched because of him, or because she marched, her steps unbroken, her eyes fixed ahead. On the third day after the ridge, they stumbled upon a small oasis, water glimmering beneath palm shadows like salvation itself. The men drank greedily, filling their canteens, splashing their faces, their laughter brief but real for the first time in days. Yet even there, where life pushed against the edge of desolation, she did not relax. She drank only enough to wet her lips, then climbed a fallen trunk and scanned the dunes. It was there that she saw it first, the faint ripple of movement too smooth to be wind, the shimmer of metal catching the sunlight. She did not shout, did not warn, only raised her rifle and fired, and in that instant the desert erupted. Enemy forces hidden among the dunes surged forward, weapons blazing, grenades shrieking through the air. The men scattered for cover, their brief reprieve shattered into chaos. Bullets tore palm leaves, sand exploded under impacts, and the air filled with the metallic scent of death. But she remained as she always was, still, calm, inevitable. Each pull of her trigger carved space for the others to breathe, each shot shifting the momentum by inches until those inches grew into survival. The commander barked orders, rallying his men around her rhythm, using her precision as the anchor for their counterattack. The fight raged longer this time, the enemy more determined, their numbers greater, their fire relentless. Yet for every advance, her rifle answered, breaking them piece by piece, until their formation faltered and the survivors once again melted back into the desert. When the dust settled, the oasis was torn and broken, trees shredded, water muddied with sand and blood. The men slumped in exhaustion, their breaths ragged, their nerves frayed to breaking, but alive. They looked at her again, expecting the same unflinching calm, and for the first time they saw something different. Not fear, not triumph, but the faintest flicker of fatigue. She wiped sweat from her brow, her hands steady even as her body betrayed its limits. The commander noticed it, though no one else did, and he felt a pang of something he could not name, pity perhaps or dread. He realized that she was not invincible, no matter how much she seemed to be. She was flesh and bone, as mortal as the rest of them, and yet the way the men watched her told him that if she ever faltered, their faith would shatter with her. That night, as the stars burned bright above the broken oasis, the commander sat beside her for the first time since the march began. For a while neither spoke, the silence stretched between them like another battlefield, but at last he said quietly, "You carry us all on your shoulders. But no one can carry forever." She did not look at him, did not answer, but he thought he saw her jaw tighten, the smallest crack in the mask she wore. And in that fragile moment, he understood that her war was not only with the enemy, but with the weight of expectation pressing down on her soul, a war that even her perfect aim could not silence forever. The march from the shattered oasis was slower, the men dragging their feet through sand that seemed endless, the heat pressing down like a punishment. Yet despite their exhaustion, they moved with an invisible tether pulling them forward, and that tether was her. She walked at the front again, her rifle slung across her back for now, her eyes never still, scanning every rise of dune, every ripple of shadow. The commander watched her as much as he watched the horizon, his mind filled with the burden of what she represented. She had become more than a soldier to them, more than a marksman whose skill could not be matched. She was their shield, their hope, their belief that survival was possible in a desert where death waited in every direction. And yet he could not shake the memory of the fatigue he had glimpsed in her eyes, the way her jaw had tightened when he had told her no one could carry forever. He knew the weight of command, knew how it pressed on a man until sleep was haunted and waking was worse, but what she bore was different. Her war was lonelier, quieter, fought in the silence of a scope's lens and the breath before a trigger pull, and though she never spoke of it, he feared it would consume her in ways no bullet could. By midday, the sun a brutal white coin above their heads, scouts returned with news of movement ahead. The supply lines they had come to sever were close, too close. Trucks loaded with weapons and fuel, escorted by armored vehicles, moved steadily through a narrow pass between dunes. It was the artery of the enemy's campaign, and cutting it would be the blow their commanders back home demanded. The men stiffened with renewed focus, though dread shadowed their determination. There were too many vehicles, too many guns, too many eyes. A frontal assault would be suicide, and even an ambush seemed perilous with their dwindling numbers and supplies. The commander studied the map, tracing lines in the sand, calculating what could be done. But even as he planned, his gaze drifted to her again, and once more he realized that the men were not watching him for direction, they were watching her. It was in their eyes, that silent question, the one that had been borne back at the first ridge. Who could make the shot that would turn impossibility into survival? And they all knew the answer. When night fell, they took their positions among the dunes, lying flat in the sand as the convoy approached. Engines rumbled like distant thunder, headlights sweeping over the desert in sharp beams of white. The men held their breath, fingers tight on triggers, hearts pounding. She lay prone at the highest crest, her rifle steady, her body still as the stars above. The commander crouched nearby, his eyes shifting between her and the convoy. He gave no orders this time, only waited, because he understood that this was not a battle he commanded. This battle belonged to her. Through her scope she watched the line of trucks snake forward, each one carrying enough supplies to fuel another month of war. She did not blink, did not shift, only tracked the lead vehicle, her breathing slow, her mind narrowing until the desert, the men, the war itself fell away, leaving only her and the target. She squeezed the trigger once, and the lead truck exploded in a bloom of fire and metal, the shockwave rattling the sand. Chaos erupted instantly. Soldiers shouted, headlights swung wildly, vehicles halted in disarray. Before the panic could settle, she fired again and another truck erupted. The narrow pass became a trap, fire spreading, metal twisting, the convoy breaking into frantic disorganization. The platoon struck then, pouring fire down from the dunes, grenades raining into the clustered vehicles. Shouts turned to screams, engines roared, but every attempt to regroup was met with another shot from her rifle, each one cutting through the night like a hammer of inevitability. The men followed her rhythm, advancing with a ferocity that belied their exhaustion, carving into the convoy until the pass was nothing but wreckage and fire. The enemy scattered, retreating in disarray, their supply lines severed, their advance crippled. Smoke rose high into the desert night, blotting the stars, and the battlefield reeked of burning fuel and shattered metal. The men collapsed among the dunes, gasping, laughing in disbelief, some crying openly, unable to contain the mix of fear and relief. The mission that had seemed impossible was done and they were still alive. Yet as they celebrated, she did not join them. She sat apart again, her rifle resting across her knees, her face expressionless, her eyes locked on the horizon beyond the smoke. The commander approached her, standing in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You did it," he said softly, but she did not answer. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, and finally she spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. "There will always be another shot." He frowned, unsure if it was resolve or warning, but when she finally looked at him, he saw no triumph in her eyes, only the weight of inevitability. And in that moment he understood the truth that had been growing within him since the first day. She was not a soldier fighting for survival, not even for victory. She was something forged to be the shot itself, an instrument of war that could not see an end. And though tonight they had won, he wondered whether they had saved themselves, or only borrowed time until the desert demanded the impossible from her once more. The fire from the convoy still burned through the night, smoke twisting into the sky like black columns that would be seen for miles, but the men no longer feared pursuit. They had struck the enemy's lifeline, torn through their supplies, and forced them into retreat. Yet with victory came a hollowness none of them had expected, because survival meant they were left alone with their thoughts, and their thoughts always led back to her. She had given them another miracle, and in that miracle lay a dangerous kind of faith, the belief that as long as she stood with them, death would not claim them. But faith built on one person was fragile, and though none dared speak it aloud, they feared the day her rifle fell silent. She sat on the edge of the dunes, away from the rest, her silhouette black against the glow of burning wreckage, motionless but not at rest. Her hands moved across the rifle with the precision of ritual, cleaning, adjusting, checking, as though the weapon were a living thing that demanded constant attention. The commander watched her from a distance, the fire painting his face in harsh light, and he wondered whether she was keeping the rifle alive, or whether it was keeping her. Morning came cruelly once again, the sun burning away the coolness of night, and with it came orders over the long-range comms that had finally cut through the static. The mission was complete, the supply lines destroyed, but extraction would not come for days. The platoon was to hold their ground, dig in, and survive until reinforcements arrived. Groans and curses slipped from dry lips, but orders were orders, and the men began to build defenses among the dunes, fashioning makeshift barriers from wreckage and sandbags. They moved slower now, their strength frayed, but their hands did not falter because when they glanced up at her, sitting high on a dune, her rifle always scanning, they drew from her silence the courage to keep going. The commander organized rotations, ensuring no one burned out completely, but when he told her to rest, she only shook her head, her eyes never leaving the horizon. He wanted to order her, to demand she close her eyes for even an hour, but the words caught in his throat. She was not a soldier who followed orders anymore, she was the reason orders could still be given at all. By midday the heat was unbearable, shimmering waves rising from the sand, the air itself trembling like glass about to shatter. Some of the men muttered deliriously, lips cracked, eyes bloodshot, but they carried on, their rifles always within reach. It was then, in that oppressive silence, that the first shot came. A bullet screamed past one soldier's head, kicking sand into his eyes, and then another slammed into a dune with brutal force. The men dove for cover, curses breaking through the suffocating heat, their eyes scanning for an enemy they could not see. The commander's heart sank. Another sniper. They were pinned again, the memory of their first ambush returning like a scar reopening. The men's fear spiked, but before panic could set in, her rifle cracked once, the sound sharp and final. Silence fell instantly, the enemy's shot line broken, the unseen threat erased with her unerring certainty. She did not even shift her posture, as if she had anticipated the attack long before it came. The men's fear dissolved into relief, but the commander's chest tightened with something heavier. Each time she saved them, their dependence deepened, and with it came the certainty that when her silence finally came, they would all fall with her. The days dragged on in a haze of heat, skirmishes and exhaustion. Enemy scouts probed their defenses, sometimes with stealth, sometimes with force, but each time they were broken, often before the men even realized danger had arrived. She became their horizon, their shield, their constant. Her rifle was the heartbeat of the platoon, and every time it cracked, they lived to breathe another hour. But the cracks in her mask grew wider. Her hands moved slower when cleaning her weapon. Her eyes lingered longer on the horizon, as if searching for something even she could not see. At night, when the men tried to sleep, the commander sometimes saw her standing alone, her rifle resting against her shoulder, her figure outlined by starlight, a sentinel who seemed less human with each passing day. He wanted to speak to her, to tell her she was not alone, but he never did. For he knew she would not listen, and worse, he feared she already belonged to the desert more than to them. On the fifth night, the enemy came in force. Trucks roared across the dunes, headlights cutting through the dark, voices shouting orders as weapons blazed. The platoon scrambled to their positions, firing into the chaos, grenades flashing, bullets screaming, sand erupting in violent plumes. It was a storm of fire and fury, the kind of battle that could break men's minds, but once again her rifle became the anchor. Each shot broke in advance, each pull of the trigger shifted the balance, until the chaos bent around her. Like a tide against stone. Men fought harder knowing she was there, and even in the thickest firestorm they felt the strange calm that came with hearing her rifle. Yet the commander, even as he fought, watched her with a growing dread. Her body moved with the same precision, her breathing steady, but there was something in her eyes now, a weight beyond fatigue, a hollowness that frightened him more than bullets. When at last the enemy broke and the desert fell silent again, the men cheered weakly, clapping shoulders, laughing in disbelief, but she did not move. She sat with her rifle across her knees, staring into the distance, her face pale in the moonlight. And for the first time since it began, the commander saw her hands tremble, just slightly, as though the burden of carrying them all had finally reached the edge of her strength. The desert gave no mercy in the days that followed, only endless heat by day and bone-deep cold by night, and though the men endured with the stubbornness of soldiers who had already outlived their odds, it was clear that the weight of survival pressed heavier with each sunrise. Their food was almost gone, their water rationed to sips, and their bodies trembled under exhaustion, but still they clung to the belief that reinforcements would come, that the mission had been worth the cost. What kept them from collapse, however, was not hope in distant promises, but the presence of the sniper who had carried them through every impossible hour. She had become more than a figure among them. She was their shadow, their fate, the reason their hearts still beat. Yet though they drew strength from her, she herself seemed to draw from nothing at all. She barely spoke, barely ate, and slept so rarely that some men whispered she did not sleep at all. Her world was the horizon, her language the crack of her rifle, her communion the silence that followed a shot. The commander watched her with increasing unease, knowing she was unraveling beneath the surface, yet powerless to stop it. She was the one keeping them alive, but every life she preserved seemed to carve deeper into her own. It was on the eighth night that the enemy came again, not in a wave of vehicles or a swarm of gunfire, but with the patient crawl of predators who had learned to fear her rifle. Shadows moved low against the dunes, nearly invisible in the starlight, slipping closer with the silence of knives. The men dozed in turns, their rifles close, but none stirred until her voice cut through the quiet, low, calm, certain. "They're here." Instantly the platoon was awake, hearts hammering as they scrambled into position, but she was already prone on the sand, her eye to the scope, her fingers steady on the trigger. The first shot broke the night like thunder, and a shadow collapsed soundlessly, its body crumpling into the sand. Then another, and another, each shot placed with surgical inevitability, until the whispers of enemy advance turned into shouts of panic. The men fired as well, the dunes erupting in flashes of light, but the rhythm belonged to her, each pull of her trigger dictating the battle. The ambush was broken before it could even form, the survivors fleeing into the darkness, their fear louder than their retreat. When silence returned, the men exhaled in shaky relief, murmuring their gratitude, but she did not answer. She only pushed herself to her knees, reloaded with mechanical precision, and once more fixed her eyes on the horizon as though waiting for the next shadow that dared to challenge her watch. By morning the commander could see the toll written on her face. Her skin was pale beneath the sunburn, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, her hands slower than before though still precise. He wanted to order her to rest, to take her rifle from her even for an hour, but he knew it was impossible. She would not allow herself to stop. And perhaps worse, the men would not allow it either. They trusted her beyond reason now, clinging to her as though she were not human but destiny itself. If she rested, their faith would fracture, and with it, their will to fight. So the commander carried the knowledge in silence, his own shoulders heavy with a burden he could not share. That day they received word over the comms at last. Reinforcements were delayed, storms had slowed their advance, and the platoon would need to hold for 2 more nights. Groans rippled through the men, curses spat into the sand, but when their eyes turned to her, their despair quieted. If she could still hold her rifle, still keep watch, then perhaps they could endure too. The commander saw this, saw the way she had become more than flesh and blood to them, and it frightened him more than the enemy's guns ever had. On the 9th night the enemy tried again. This time they brought mortars, shells screaming through the air, exploding sand and fire into the defenses the platoon had built. The dunes shook under the bombardment, the men scrambling for cover as shock waves rattled their bones. Screams tore through the smoke, cries for medics, shouts of orders drowned beneath the thunder. Yet even in the storm her rifle spoke. Through dust and fire, through the chaos of collapsing dunes, she found targets the others could not even see, silencing the mortar crews one by one. Each shot was a defiance of the chaos, a reminder that death was not theirs to claim while she still breathed. The commander fought alongside his men, but his eyes were drawn to her silhouette in the smoke, the way she seemed untouchable, inevitable, even as shells rained down. The enemy faltered under her precision, their bombardment unraveling into panic, and once more they broke, retreating into the night. When it ended, the battlefield was scarred, bodies strewn across the sand, the air heavy with smoke and blood. The men staggered among the ruins of their defenses, patching wounds, counting losses, but still alive. And once again their eyes turned to her. She sat apart as she always did, her rifle across her knees, her face unreadable. But the commander, watching closely, saw the tremor in her hands grow worse, saw the hollowness in her eyes deepen, and he knew what the others did not. She was carrying them still, but she was breaking under the weight, piece by piece, shot by shot. And when the time came that she could no longer lift the rifle, when her silence finally fell, he feared that the men would not know how to survive without her. In that moment he realized that the question was no longer who could make the shot. The question was who they would be when the shot was gone. The dawn of the 10th day broke red over the desert, the sky painted in streaks of fire that bled into the dunes as if the earth itself knew the battle was not finished. The men stirred with weary groans, their bodies beaten but still alive, their eyes sunken yet burning with the stubbornness that only survival could forge. Reinforcements were supposed to arrive by now, yet the comms carried only static, and with each passing hour the hope of rescue dimmed. Still they waited, still they endured because she was there. She sat at the highest crest of sand, her rifle balanced across her knees, her gaze unbroken, the embodiment of their faith. The commander stood beside her, silent, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the horizon with her. He no longer tried to tell her to rest, no longer tried to ease the weight she carried, because he had accepted the truth. She would never lay it down, not until the end came, one way or another. And when it came, it did not come as a wave or a storm but as a tide of steel, an army surging across the dunes with engines roaring and banners whipping in the hot wind. The enemy had gathered everything they had left, a final effort to crush the survivors and erase them from the desert. The ground trembled beneath the march of armored vehicles, the air split with the echo of war drums that were the thunder of engines and the clatter of weapons. The platoon froze at the sight, despair clawing at their hearts, because no rifle, no matter how precise, could stop what came for them now. The commander felt the weight of it press down on his chest, the knowledge that this was the end, that they had carried the mission farther than anyone could have asked, but that fate had finally caught them. He looked at her and she was already prone, her eye to the scope, her breath steady, as though the impossible was not impossible at all. Her first shot cracked through the morning, striking the lead vehicle and sending it lurching sideways, smoke pouring from its engine. The men rallied, lifting their rifles, pouring fire into the advancing tide, but even as they fought, they knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded by inevitability. Yet she kept firing, each shot a defiance, each bullet a declaration that death would not take them quietly. Vehicles burned, soldiers fell, and the enemy advance staggered again and again under her relentless precision. The men shouted, their despair turning into fury, their courage stoked by the impossible rhythm of her rifle. They fought like men who had nothing to lose because in truth, they had already given everything. The battle raged through the morning, a storm of smoke and fire, until the dunes themselves seemed to bleed. The enemy pressed harder, their numbers endless, and still she fired. Her hands trembled, her breathing ragged, sweat streaking through the dust on her face, but her eye never left the scope. The commander saw her falter once, just once, as her hands shook so violently he feared she would drop the rifle. But she forced herself steady, forced her finger to pull the trigger again, and another enemy fell. She was unraveling in front of him, burning herself out shot by shot, but still she carried them, still she refused to break. The men around her fought with a kind of madness now, no longer afraid, because they had given their faith so fully to her that even death felt distant as long as her rifle spoke. And then, through the smoke, through the chaos, came the sound they had almost stopped believing in, the thundering blades of helicopters, the roar of Allied engines, the sky filling with the promise of reinforcements. The commander lifted his head, disbelief etched on his face as aircraft swept over the dunes, missiles streaking down into the enemy ranks, tearing their advance apart. Cheers erupted from the men, tears spilling down dust-stained cheeks as salvation rained from above. The enemy faltered, broke, and fled into the desert, their final push crushed beneath the weight of reinforcements and the endless defiance of the platoon that would not die. The men shouted, embraced, some collapsing in relief as they realized they were truly saved. But the commander did not celebrate. His eyes were on her. She was still prone on the dune, her rifle clutched in trembling hands, her body shaking with exhaustion. Slowly, she lowered the weapon, her gaze drifting from the horizon to the sky where the helicopters circled, her expression unreadable. The commander knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. For a long moment she did not answer, her eyes fixed upward as if trying to decide whether to believe it. Finally she whispered, her voice so faint he almost missed it, "Until the next shot." He felt the chill of her words, the truth buried inside them. For the men, the war had ended in victory, salvation arriving with fire from the sky. But for her there would never be an end. She was bound to the rifle, bound to the horizon, bound to the inevitability of the next impossible shot. When they were lifted into the helicopters, when the desert finally fell away beneath spinning blades, the men wept and cheered, their faith rewarded, their bodies saved. She sat in silence, her rifle resting across her lap, her eyes staring out the window at the dunes that stretched endless below. The commander sat across from her, watching, and he understood at last the truth that had haunted him from the beginning. She had not been created by the war. The war had only revealed what she already was. A weapon, yes, but more than that, a destiny that none of them could carry or comprehend. And as the desert shrank into the distance, he knew that when the world asked again who could make the impossible shot, the answer would always be the same. He would point upward toward her and say with certainty, "Her."